welcome to the Scriptures Are Real broadcast, the broadcast where we love to talk about the Scriptures and elements of them that have become real for us and that have made it so that we can draw more power from the Scriptures. I'm your host, Kerry, and this is a short cast where we're going to talk a little bit about Abraham's life and the book of Abraham and elements that where I've been studying his life that have just made him become a little more real to me. None of these are particularly doctrinally significant. I'll just remind you that if you are interested in more about Abraham's life or the Abrahamic covenant or the book of Abraham, that I have lots of podcasts on that on my own channel. You can find a podcast on the book of Abraham, on the facsimiles, interviews with Phil Allred, Stephen Tager, or Rebecca Call about Abraham and his life. You can go to outofthedust.org and find pages that have to do with the book of Abraham, that have to do with the Abrahamic covenant. I've got a book and articles on that. You can find those resources on there, a brochure on there. You can find my YouTube channel, historical and geographical videos about it. So that's not what this is going to be. This is just going to be just some fun little things that I've experienced as I've studied the book of Abraham. And I want to highlight the work that some others have done as they've studied the book of Abraham that may have helped us just kind of get a little bit of a better taste for Abraham and what his life was really like. One of the interesting things to me as we read in the book of Abraham, we go to chapter 1, and I've talked elsewhere about the significance of the covenant that we see here in this first several verses. Especially the idea that Abraham is seeking for greater happiness and peace and rest, and he receives the covenant that was established by his father, that was established to Father Adam, and so on. But I want to focus on this issue that we get where it talks about a priest offering Abraham upon the altar. And it turns out, and you may have heard me talk about this elsewhere, in which case you can just fast forward real quickly. But when I first was studying Egyptology at UCLA, I was taught that the Egyptians didn't engage in human sacrifice. And I wasn't really concerned about that because you can see in Abraham chapter 1 that it says that the priest of Pharaoh is also doing things that are a mixture of Canaanite and probably Mesopotamian, but anyway, at least Canaanite and Egyptian religious practices. We can say Chaldean. There's a question of where the Chaldeans are at this time, the Chaldu, but they seem to, before they migrate over into Mesopotamia, they seem to have been kind of Syrian area, we can say Syro-Phoenician area, something like that. But in any case, there's this mixture of religious practices going on. So I just figured we know that the Canaanites engaged in human sacrifice and child sacrifice, and that is described in the text. And I still don't think that the Egyptians really did child sacrifice. So I would guess that the sacrifice of a child that is being mentioned in here is it's a Canaanite practice, although it does say in chapter 1, verse 9, it came to pass that the priest made an offering unto the god Pharaoh, and it's talking about a child, the god Pharaoh, and also to the god of Shagril, even after the manner of the Egyptians. And so I think that probably means that it's an Egyptian priest who does it in an Egyptian way, but it's a Canaanite kind of sacrifice, would be my best guess as to what's happening there. In any case, I wasn't too concerned about the fact that Egyptians didn't do human sacrifice because this seemed like it was a mixture of practices. And so as people asked me, and I was teaching Institute at the time there at UCLA, I'd say, no, the Egyptians didn't do that kind of thing. And then I had a friend that pointed out that they did. There was a little bit of evidence for them doing it anyway, a little teeny bit of evidence. This is a fellow graduate student. And he pointed me to some work by Professor Robert Rittner. And so I started studying that a little bit further and determined that indeed he did do or the Egyptians did sometimes engage in human sacrifice. And I was so intrigued by that, and not just by the human sacrifice, but just what was it in Egyptian religious culture or Egyptian culture in general that would cause them to do that when we thought that they didn't. And so that became my dissertation topic, which became a book and many articles and many lectures and so on. Religious or sanctioned killing in ancient Egypt and the religious reasons behind that. And I did that because I got interested or intrigued in the topic through a Book of Abraham connection, but I really just studied the topic for interest in and of itself. But then, of course, I saw that there were Book of Abraham connections. And what was interesting is that the picture that I found as I studied the Book of Abraham, as I studied the practice in ancient Egypt, matched incredibly well the picture that was in the Book of Abraham. So you have just this idea that when someone has done something that disturbs the correct religious order, that the way to answer that was with a ritual answer. And if it was something that raised to the level of needing to kill a person, then of course you killed them ritually, which we call human sacrifice. I called it, what did I call it? Ritual slaying. In the kind of a technical term, because I didn't want to get it mixed up with ritual, or kind of rampant human sacrifice we see in like Mesoamerica or something like that. But anyway, it's the same thing. It turns out that it matched it incredibly well, and I understood it all the better because of, say, Rittner's work and my own work and the work of a few others on this topic. And it fit better and better and better with the picture I was developing all the time. In fact, I once Professor Rittner wrote that while I understood some things about human sacrifice, he didn't quite see it happening the way that it was described in the Book of Abraham. And I thought, I thought it was obvious, but I need to connect the dots better. So I wrote an article about that and then was asked to submit that article to the Journal of Near Eastern Archaeology. It wasn't about the Book of Abraham, but about the reasons for human sacrifice. I thought it just connected the dots perfectly. But anyway, that was published in the Journal of Near Eastern Archaeology. Research I was doing already because it became clear I hadn't made the things as clear as I thought they were to me, that I needed to spell it out a little more clearly to others. And they asked for that article. And so I submitted that and it was accepted after peer review and so on. I thought it painted the picture very well. And what was fun for me is that I was able to, using both the Book of Abraham and the Egyptological things, put a couple things together to answer some questions that I'd had. So just as an example, in the Book of Abraham, you have facsimile 1, where it has this depiction of a priest with a knife, but you have all of these ancient traditions about Abraham. And this is really, there are some fun ancient traditions. So there's an ancient tradition, a number of ancient traditions where Abraham is nearly sacrificed, a high number, none of which, at least as far as I know, none of which would have been available to Joseph Smith at the time. I can actually check that because I made a chart about that in my little book. Let's talk about the Book of Abraham. So while I'm telling this story, I'll find that chart and see if I'm remembering correctly that wasn't available at the time. But anyway, no, that was available in other sources in Joseph Smith's day. So he maybe, I doubt he had, but he maybe could have encountered that elsewhere. But anyway, there are a large number of traditions that Abraham is nearly sacrificed. And in most of these traditions, they want to sacrifice him by burning him. And some of the stories really are charming. Like there's one that says Abraham went to a place where there were a bunch of idols and he broke down all of the idols but one. And then when they came in and they said, "What happened here?" And Abraham said, "That idol broke all of these other idols down." And they said, "He couldn't have done that." And then Abraham says, "Then why are you worshiping a God that couldn't do that?" And they didn't like it. So, but I thought it was odd that they always, all these ancient traditions talked about trying to burn Abraham, but we have the Book of Abraham showing them with a knife. And then as I was reading about how the Egyptians described what they were going to do when they were going to sacrifice someone, they would talk about doing it in the same way they did animals. And they would talk about striking them with a blade and then burning them, which of course is what you do with an animal sacrifice, right? You don't just throw the lamb or the goat on the altar in the fire while it's alive. You use a knife and you kill it, and then you make it a burnt offering. And so that made sense to me that that's what they were planning on doing with Abraham, but it didn't work out for them, fortunately. So that's a fun little thing. There are lots of other interesting things. So if we just even look at the way that the book of Abraham is structured, I have a friend named John Gee who has done some research. He wanted to compare the way this is really kind of an autobiography that Abraham is writing. And so we wanted to compare it to other autobiographies of the time period. Well, we really only have one other autobiography from the same time and the same place. And so in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, John Gee, who has done, I think at the time it's called the Journal of Book of Mormon and Other Restoration Scripture, but John Gee published this great article comparing Abraham and a fellow named Idrimi and their accounts and their autobiographies, and finds that the structure and the style match incredibly well, that it just works. This seems to be the kind of document that really you would expect to be written by someone at that time period who's writing about their own life. It just fits in with that time and that style and so on. So you can read that article if you're interested in it. But of course, there are other layers that we would expect because this seems to be the copy of the book of Abraham we have seems to be a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy that is then recopied and probably reworked a little bit, because that usually happens around 200 BC. And so we would expect then, if it's like other books of scripture and other ancient documents, that there might be a couple of little additions or insertions that would reflect that later time period. And so I have a friend, Avram Shannon, who is working on that and finding exactly that thing, that he thinks that there are a couple of layers of the text that only fit in that what we call the Ptolemaic, but it's this Greek influenced Egyptian time period when the Greeks are ruling Egypt, that it only fits in that context. And so he says it's really interesting that the two time periods we would expect to find would be information that matches with Abraham's day and information that matches with the Ptolemaic or the Greco-Roman era in this one specific time period, a fairly narrow time period, not really the Roman era, but just the Greek period. And that's exactly what we find, the evidence for those two time periods. And, he and I often goof around, well, if Joseph Smith is guessing, he is one good guesser to be able to say that's what's going on here and create something that matches those two time periods. So there are all sorts of fun things like that. John Gee has done a lot of work on this. He's found, I find just fascinating research where he thought, okay, let's look at Egyptian control and the areas where we think that Abraham would have been and where Egypt is controlling or not. So I think I talked in my other episode about geography and so on, about that it seems like there's a decent chance is in kind of northern Syria, southern Turkey, in an area that would be really just about straight east of the northernmost tip of Cyprus, somewhere around there, near, if you're familiar with any of this, ancient Ebla, or maybe just a little bit south and west of modern Aleppo. In any case, it's probably somewhere in that area, based on the name Olishem or Ulisum that we talked about last time in that other podcast. So John Gee did some research. When does Egypt control these areas? When does it not? If he's going to flee from there to Haran, and we know where Haran is, when would it make sense that he's in an area that's controlled by Egypt, but he can get to Haran and it's not controlled by Egypt? And then maybe a little bit later, it'd be safe for him to come into Canaan and so on. And I actually found that there's one time period where this works really well, and it's exactly kind of the time period you would expect it to be happening under the reign of Senusret or Sesostris III of Egypt, is probably when Abraham is fleeing into Haran, but then he comes down into Canaan a little bit later when Egyptian control of that area is slipping, and Egyptian control even in Egypt is slipping. And so I think we can kind of see how these time periods work. It also works with the stuff I mentioned in the last podcast, where George Pierce has been looking at when there was a famine, and that timing just works. It all just fits so well. The story just is coming together, so we can kind of guess about when, Abraham's about 2000 BC, but he's moving in out of Ur when there is tight control by Senusret III, but he's coming down into Canaan a little bit later than that, which is exactly the time we see this period of drought starting, and he's down into Egypt to avoid that. And as he comes up within a few years, the drought's ending and we're getting this period of abundance. All of this, there's so many puzzle pieces that fit together so well, it's fun. Let's just mention maybe one other. You'll note that it talks about a number of gods that were these kind of Canaanite gods, but they're also seemingly being patronized by this syncretistic or mixed together Egyptian Canaanite process that's going on, and that kind of thing we expect. We get the names of gods like Elkanah and Libnah and Mamachra and Korash. So people have done some research on that. John Giegen has done some really interesting research where he's identified ancient attestations of all four of those gods. And some of them we know quite a bit about. Elkanah we know quite a bit about, but he's done some fun research where we can identify all four of those. I've done some research where we can see that Egyptian priests in the time of Abraham would have been very interested in story. I mean, not in the time of Abraham, but in the time of when the papyrus that has facsimile 1 on it was created, that there were Egyptian priests in the time and place where it's created that were interested in stories about Abraham. And so that's a wonderful, fun little piece of the puzzle that comes together. By the way, you can hear more about that and about this particular priest. We know a lot about him, one that owned facsimile 1, and why he would be interested in a copy of the Book of Abraham and the story of Abraham. And I think there's some it just makes sense when you learn about what he's doing. It actually makes sense that he'd be interested in what's in the text of the Book of Abraham and the story that's told about Abraham in there. Makes a lot of sense. I think we can also, sorry, my mic is falling a little bit. I need to tighten this up on this. There we go. Okay. So that makes sense. I think we can do a lot of work with what's going on with war. You can read or hear more about that in my podcasts on the Book of Abraham that are here on my podcast channel or the YouTube channel. I went even more into depth in some lessons I did for a group called Gospel Scholars, where I did 2 different courses on the Book of Abraham. So it's a long enough format. I was able to go really into depth. It's called Gospel Scholars, by the way. So you have to subscribe to that. It's not free, but if you type in Kerry 25, so that's Kerry 25, you can get 25% off. Anyway, there are lots of places where we talk about it. So there are all sorts of fun things going on. I wanted to show you or talk about one other thing, which is a place called pearlofgreatpricecentral.org. So there's a Book of Abraham.org, which can get you a lot of good information besides my own place, outofthedust.org. And then there's pearlofgreatpricecentral.org, where they go through well, I say they, I was a part of creating this, but all sorts of interesting things and short little articles. They even have a little video, but short little articles, many of which talk about the kinds of things I'm doing that just help the Book of Abraham become more real to you. So you can look at this cow that's in facsimile 2 and how that matches up Egyptologically, or the 4 figures that represent the 4 quarters of the earth and how that matches up Egyptologically, or Egyptianisms that we find in the Book of Abraham, or ideas about creation happening by council, chiasmus, ancient poetic forms in the Book of Abraham, foreordination in the Book of Abraham that we also find evidence for in the ancient world, and the creation motifs that we've talked about in here. Anyway, Kolob, the Divine Council, all sorts of interesting things. So that's a fun little resource for you as well, if you're interested in going to pearlofgreatpricecentral.org. I guess, I could ramble on forever, but what I'd just like to say is that it is so much fun to study the ancient world and see how much it teaches us about the Book of Abraham, and how much the Book of Abraham helps me understand the ancient world better, and how well these things match up. It makes it become more real to me. Abraham's life is more real to me because I can understand basically where he was, basically when he was, the pressures that were on him from what it's like to be a nomad, the pressures that are on him from what it's like to be It's someone who's trying to flee Egyptian influence, the pressures that are on him from a famine. All of those things make his life and Sarah's life become very, very real to me. And that becomes very applicable to me then. And I am grateful for that, and hope that this is at least a little bit helpful for you as well.